Okay guys, part 2 of the talks, how to be a master builder. Part of it is understanding this classical tradition. The other part is understanding historic precedent. So this is a talk on historic precedent. I gave it at North Bennett Street to the preservation program. I want you guys to understand it. Let me know what you guys think. I'm Brent Hull, thanks for watching. There's the classical understanding, but there's also historic precedent that is a reminder of how things should look, a reminder of what looks right and what doesn't. And so understanding the American architectural tradition, I think, is really important as you begin to piece things together, begin to design things. As people ask you to build a mantle, for instance, is it going to be a Georgian mantle or a Federal mantle or a Greek Revival mantle or what's it going to be? And then how does that look based on that style? Same thing, you got to put a front door on a house. Is it a Victorian house? Is it a Georgian house? Is it, what is it? And so I want you to see and understand history of home building in America, kind of what's going on here. Understand the power of historic building and what it can teach us. One way of thinking about historic styles is not necessarily Georgian, when does that start, when does that end, Federal, when does that, but eras. And so I've kind of breaking it out into 3 eras. This pre-industrial era, the handmade era, which is 1740 to 1840, that handles Georgian, Federal, and Greek Revival house styles. Industrial Revolution starts and it really changes building. You think about wrought nails to cut nails, or the framing types and things we'll talk about. And those architectural styles, kind of that early Victorian to the period revival and right before World War II. And then this era, this post-World War II era, I'm calling it the business of building, production building, McMansions. And a lot of you guys are asking questions about this era, okay, about the problems with this and what's happened to building and how I can make those statements that I've made. A lot of it is because of what happens here, and we'll get into that. But first, let's just spend a little bit of time talking about the Georgian and Federal in the pre-industrial era. So this is an era of handmade. Everything's made by hand. Bricks are made by hand. Glass is made by hand. Hardware, all the things that go into a house. This is Mount Airy in Virginia. Josiah Quincy home here. These are all Georgian houses. Notice the symmetry. Notice that the fact that they're all even and laid out based on that classical tradition. Even the interiors are based on that. So you see the same kind of symmetry. A lot of times in these Georgian houses and Federal houses, this will be a brick wall behind here because symmetry was so important. They wanted to balance it out, and that kind of effort that they would go to balance out and get the symmetry was very important. Talked about Palladio and his influence, but certainly he basically invented an architectural style that became very important in England with the English country house. That then had a strong presence in America. This is Drayton Hall in South Carolina. And so in this Georgian style, you're seeing this symmetry, this balance. You're also seeing kind of a heavier molding, a heavier look to how the parts and pieces are put together. In comparison to the Federal period, which is kind of post Revolutionary War into the 1820s. Obviously this house here in Boston. I'm going to stop here because this is a Robert Adam interior. Okay, Robert Adam was an architect, Scottish architect in England. And what happens during this period of time is that all these young men are going to Europe for finishing school. They're going on a grand tour. And a grand tour was this trip that they took, that they went to France and they hung out in the courts and kind of learned about dress and perfume of all things and courtly manners. And then they went down to Italy to learn about architecture and design. And so they would study these ancient buildings. They'd study the Roman ruins and things like that. And for a long time during the Georgian period, they thought that Roman interiors looked like Roman exteriors. And so moldings are very thick and big and bold and everything else. And what happened was Pompeii is rediscovered about 1770s. Pompeii was the town that got covered with ashes and got basically sealed in time. Luckily, the Naples king was doing a thing. They rediscovered Pompeii. They began to excavate the town and realized and found original Roman rooms. And they looked not like this exactly, but they had this kind of decoration. They were very simple. They didn't have big moldings. The swags and the urns and the different things that you see, the motifs that they're showing here were all things that they saw in the interior of Pompeii rooms. And so it was the neoclassical era starts as they rediscover what classical interiors were like. Remember, classical era, then the Gothic, and then the Renaissance. So they are post-Renaissance, right? This is 1760 that they discovered Pompeii, and they re-look at how these rooms are put together. And so these colors, pinks and reds and greens and things like that, were all things that they saw in the interior of the rooms. And my point in this is that the reason Georgian and Federal are so different is because of Robert Adam and what he did and how he changed the look of buildings and how they changed the feel of things. So when you start to see the leaded glass with this kind of decoration, with this kind of detail and these colors, right? That's all part of that Federal neoclassical era. And this is an example of understanding history, understanding, how things are changing and designing accordingly. This is Samuel McIntyre, one of my heroes, master builder out of Salem. One of his rooms at the Philadelphia Museum. But you see in the architrave, in the frieze, you see these swags and the little urns and the different things. Same thing here in the fireplace, right? There's your entablature. But this is why the Federal period is expressed that way, because there's been a change in understanding about how things were designed and how things are put together. So then in the same era, you have the Greek Revival. So the Greek Revival becomes very important 1820, 1830 to about 1860. Becomes very important because we as Americans, let's say the American Revolution, 1780, we're starting to become a country. 30, 40 years later, the Greeks are going through their War of Independence. 1820 is when their War of Independence is. And we associate very strongly with the Greek because they were an early democracy. And our democracy, an early experiment, we don't think of it that way today, but it was a new thing, a new form of government, and it was working, and people were very proud about it. And so we wanted to express this Greek Revival ideal in our buildings and in our houses and in how we built. And so you see a strong association within this. Now, remember, we're in that first era. We're in that pre-industrial era, and we are still heavily influenced by this classicism. Obviously, the Greek Revival going back to the Greek period, but you still have the symmetry, still have the balance. Then you see that all through this early era. Where you see this classicism, column, entablature, same thing around the doorway, very important to how things are put together. And look at the three, this is a Georgian interior, this is Gunston Hall, William Buckland down in Virginia. There's that Samuel McIntyre, and there's the Greek Revival at Winterthur, right? Three different ways of expressing interiors. Moldings change, okay? Organization of how it's put together changes, but those same ideals carried through, same strong classicism, but expressed very differently. Same thing with mantles. I was asking about, someone says put a door, someone says build a mantle. Notice the Georgian mantle, Federal mantle, Greek Revival mantle, how they're different, how they're expressed differently. Greek Revival oftentimes were very stone-like, right? Because we looked at the Greek culture and the stone culture, so that fireplace almost could be made out of stone because of the way it was put together and the ideals it was trying to express. So that's pre-industrial, okay? Now we go into the industrial era, which is 1850-ish, right at about 1930, right before World War II. And you have the steam-powered engine basically able to change the way that we're building, from millwork to essentially everything, with these early factories that were making things faster and cheaper than ever thought possible. Now, preservation, you guys will do things about dating nails and things like that, but just understanding that in the pre-industrial era, everything was handmade, even nails. Then you get into the machine era and things are cut nails. And now in our era, you've got pneumatic nails and things like that, but a very strong and easy way of dating a house by looking at nails and how things are fastened and the power of screws, right? In the last 20 years, how screws have taken over as far as their interest. the way we frame houses, from timber frame to balloon framing to Western framing, all those things, understanding the differences between those, when those happen, why they happened. These houses are going to be built very differently, constructed differently. The materials are going to be different. They're going to come from machine shops. They're going to be more elaborate because we're able to make the barge board like this on a saw in a machine in a factory much cheaper and faster than would have been made by hand. And so, whether it's Second Empire or Italianate or whatever these different styles are, you see that these houses end up being, compartmentalized, whereas early Georgian and Federal houses tend to be boxes. They're boxes because they're making them from timber frames. By the time you get into stick framing, you can do all these crazy things because framing's much more adaptable, much easier to do. Shingle style up in New England, Richardson Romanesque, you're seeing these influences come from, this tends to be a very medieval style, an effort to, showing off this stonework that never would have been possible except with quarries and things like that. Classicism, this neoclassical style where you see those columns all over this house. Chateauest, the French influence. So you're seeing a lot of European influences making their way to America as far as how we build. Get into the rejection of the Victorian and the arts and crafts era with the craftsman style houses. Green House in California. Anybody been there? It's my favorite house in America. You guys need to go there. The Roby House in Chicago. You're seeing is styles changing faster and influence as papers, as travel, as other things are happening around the world, that we're able to get influences from other areas. This is also a Frank Lloyd Wright house. Very horizontal lines versus the vertical lines of the Victorian. Again, the rejection of all that Victorian ornamentation. And then into the 20s and 30s, you get into the period revival houses, which are influenced by the European styles. A lot of architects had gone over to Europe in World War I. They were enamored and blown away by the cottages of the French and English countrysides and wanted to come back and recreate those styles in America. And you end up seeing these strong European influences in the houses, the French and English and European stylings showing up in our houses from that period. We got to look at kit houses because kit houses are kind of the signal in time that building's changing, okay? That building is easier, okay? That building is assembled, okay? Because essentially Sears, Montgomery Ward, Aladdin, and others were offering houses that would be shipped to your location by rail. And all of these, all the parts and pieces, sometimes labeled, would be on one order, would be on one train car. So these are all the different companies. This is the number of houses they built. This is kind of when they were around. Aladdin obviously lasted the longest. They built the most. But Sears and Roebuck from 1908 to 1940 really built a great number of homes. And this was their molding catalogs and building catalogs, Montgomery Ward's and Sears, how they were selling houses and selling full things. And notice the way the millwork's coming, crated and put together like that, ready to assemble in your house. This is the Sears house. This is their nicest house, okay? Already cut and fitted, okay? So basically studs came pre-cut. Sometimes with the Aladdin houses, the bottom plate had a notch in it where you'd sit your stud. Look at all the different things in here. It includes millwork, lumber, laths, shingles, porch ceilings, siding, flooring, finished lumber, eaves, troughs, downspouts, sash weights, hardware. Colonnades, roofing, painting materials, mantles, tile. Everything was there. It's kind of crazy, okay, that in the early 1900s, the ready to assemble, that house, okay, would come in a railroad car for you to assemble on your property. So a lot of these things were sent to farmers. A lot of these things were sent to areas where they didn't have, access to a lot of labor, so that they could put it together themselves. But there's websites now that trace these things and chronicle these things, where they're built and when they were built and things like that. And so these houses exist all over the country. From a building perspective, though, it speaks to how building has changed. You think when timber framing, pre-1840, that period of time when timber framing was the predominant way of building, balloon framing was kind of a derogatory term for framing, that it looks like a balloon that's going to blow away. And so the idea of stick framing, of putting together houses with nails, right, was like, you're doing what? Well, fast forward 150 years and you have the simplicity of building getting to a point where, they're sending it to do-it-yourselfers ready to install and build their own house. So building has really changed quite a bit. The Martha Washington, a simpler house, and then even the cottage. And realize that there's a whole, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, there was a lot of these Aladdin and Sears built houses that were, I don't know if it says it here, but some of these could be built in a matter of days, right? So that they were put together so fast and the parts and pieces ready to go. But I mean, what is there? Living room, kitchen, and bedroom. That's a small house. But it speaks to, I wanted to spend a little time there to show you how much building has changed. Now we are into the 20th century, into the 1900s. The second piece that's happened is not only has building gotten easier, but building styles are about to change in a major way, okay? Because of modernism, because of production building. But this is the advertisements that took place in the 20s, okay? This is a building developer magazine building Mediterranean villas or whatever those style are. It's a little English class in a building cover of a building magazine, and this really changes a great deal. A little dramatic, but things are about to change quite a bit. And that's where we get into the third era of building, which is the post-World War II. First thing that has to be asked is what happened to architects and design? Realize that in the 1920s, if you hired an architect to design you a house, okay, he would design a Mediterranean Revival house. And those same architects were working for Montgomery Ward's doing the Mediterranean Revival styles for their buildings, right? Just like Walgreens are all the same. There is an architectural division for Walgreens. Not a very big group because they all look the same, but there was an architectural emphasis that happened. So pre-World War II, if you a commercial architect could design both, okay? Post-World War II, they no longer do. So, you think about what Levitt was building in 1950, and then the Seagram's building in New York, and how much building has changed. Because what's happening, guys, is there is a split that is taking place. That, Frank Lloyd Wright, early 1900s or late 1800s into the 1950s, 95% of his houses were residential houses. 95% of his projects were residential houses. Frank Gehry or some of the big name architects today, they would never even consider doing a residential house. So there's a split that takes place that the architect community is kind of ignoring the residential side of things as being not as important, and to really gain fame and gain importance as an architect, you need to be doing commercial things. So there's a split here. What that means is that the architect is abandoning residential design. So the other important thing is that what happens right around the 1920s up into the post-World War time period. The Great Depression, 1929, even going back into 1926, the number of houses being built in a year was 1 million houses in 1926. By 1929, it actually dropped. And 1 million houses is even still today kind of that number that we need to be building in order to keep up with demand. Okay, so it's still a number that's being used today. Housing starts fall to their lowest in 1933, about 10% of what they were in 1929. So if they're building 1 million houses in 1926, by 1933 it was less than 100,000 houses a year. Okay. That whole period of the 1930s kind of is this way. It kind of gets better, doesn't get better, kind of gets better. And then World War II starts in 1941. So realize that in 1942, there's actually a moratorium on building. You can't even build houses because they're trying to conserve materials for the war purpose. And then we get out of the war in 45, and 16 million GIs come back in 1946. So from 26 to 46, 20-year period of time, we are not building houses. The number of houses being built in America is very low. And this is huge, guys, because it means when those 16 million GIs get back, people are doubling up and tripling up. There's stories of people living in silos and train cars because there just is no housing. And that's a big reason why, Levitt was so popular and so important. He's on the cover of Time magazine. These are his houses in 1949, 50. They originally started out as being rental houses, rental properties, but realized that those houses are about 600 square feet, maybe 800 square feet. Now, a typical house in 1920, the average size house was about 1,400 square feet. So he was building a smaller house, no basements. Okay, people go, you're crazy, these aren't going to sell. And he completely changed the way these houses were being built. He broke the house down into 26 steps. He had 4 house styles. And so there was a Levittown in New York, there's one in Philadelphia, I think there's 3 of them around. But he had 4 house styles at first, and then he went to 5 house styles because he added the ranch style. But he would orient them differently on the lot and just the way they were facing so that it all didn't look the same. He's the one that started doing windy roads through neighborhoods so it didn't look like cookie cutter houses. Didn't put wood on the floor. There was asphalt floors. Pre-assembling of parts. Like I said, he was at these 26 steps. So essentially what he did, and the genius of Levitt and also the bane of Levitt, is that he figured out neighborhoods, and he figured out the way, he was designing these neighborhoods so the kids never had to cross a busy street to go to school. So that you had a local grocery store, that you had this community that you could live in. He was big on Little League baseball. So all of his communities had Little League baseball parts. At the same time, this idea of breaking the house into 26 steps was a way to break the union. Because instead of hiring carpenters who could frame the house, trim the house, sheathe the house, roof the house, he broke it into parts so that when you came into a Levitt neighborhood, you basically, you had a group of farmers that only set walls, okay? And then another group that only did the roof rafters, and another group that only did sheathing. He had guys that walk around with a blue paint bucket and a red paint bucket. I mean, he broke it down. He declared that he was not a builder, that he was a manufacturer. And at his best, completely vertically integrated, he knew how many nails went into every house that he built. It's crazy, right? It's just the things that he was doing. He owned his own forest. He owned his own nail factory. He completely vertically integrated. He was building, it's more houses than that today were completed. Levitt was building thousands of houses a year, whereas in the 20s, a big developer, a big production builder was building 200. And he was building in the thousands. So he changed the way people thought about building, and he changed this whole idea of production building. And that's the reason I had that nuclear bomb going off, is because production building is the reason why there's so much crap today, in my opinion. Because Levitt came along, trained a generation or two how to build cheap and fast, and that was his focus, cheap and fast. And the reason why is because there's so many people that needed houses. There's stories of him on opening weekends coming out and selling 1,000 houses on a weekend. Now, why was that? Well, if you think about, these people are living in Philadelphia, New York. They've been living in the same apartments for 20 years because of the war and the Great Depression. There's been no improvements. There's stories of them sharing bathrooms on the halls with these other families. They would come out to Levitt Developments, and he gave them a yard. They had a washer and dryer, which no one had, and it was basically for, if you're a GI, no money down, but $50 to $70 a month was your payment. Well, that's what you were paying in the city, and you got a yard. He had to teach people how to mow the grass because no one had mowed the grass. And so it's kind of a crazy way he changed the way we built and everything else. But here's examples of kind of his pre-built things. They had radiant heat floors. A lot of stuff was pre-built off-site. The plumbing trees came in pre-built, ready to set in the foundation. And it really was astounding the way he thought about building and how he sped things forward and made things better. These were his house styles. And he would brag that I can build my house faster, sell it for $1,000 less, and make $1,000 more than every other builder out there. You're seeing design change, right? This is the Farnsworth house in Illinois, Mies van der Rohe. This was called a case study house. and basically realized that not only were builders trying to push things to be cheaper and faster, but so were architects. And because everybody was trying to solve the housing crisis, a little bit like today. And so these case study houses were houses that were meant to be prefab, were meant to be an architect's approach to how to build something cheap and fast. And so it wasn't just builders that were looking for shortcuts. It was the whole industry that was thinking about building this way. So it's no wonder that these ranch-style houses, like Eichler's house out in California, end up being these very simple forms. You think about Frank Lloyd Wright, his Usonian houses. That was an effort to build a house that every man could afford and things like that. But my point is that, and you'll see in some of these slides, the industry has changed. There's been a dynamic shift away from craft and towards speed and production. And some of those questions that you guys were asking earlier, as I say, that's talk two, is I'm showing you why things change so much. Builder magazines that used to have these quaint, pretty English revival pictures are now about, building fast and building cheap. It's this building, there's the number of houses that were being built I was telling you about. So 26, right, that was that big year. By 33, it's way down here, a little bit of bump up in the 30s, and then it's way down low again. We don't get over 1 million houses a year until, right when we get back, and then we're building in the 2 million houses a year. So it's a huge boom that takes place right after World War II that changes our building. There was a study done called American Housing in 1942. It's a government-sanctioned study that basically wanted to figure out, so they're trying to solve the housing crisis just like everybody else. And they're saying, why can't we build houses like we build cars? We build these well-designed cars that come off assembly lines. Why can't we do that with houses? And they did a study of house and home building and things like that, and they came up with 4 reasons why it couldn't work. It's because builders were small, regionally located. They only built 1 to 4 houses a year. They were undercapitalized. They didn't, have big banks and things like that. Regionally, they weren't spread across a big region. But the biggest problem they found, the reason they couldn't do it, was because builders spent too much time crafting houses instead of trying to build them fast. That was the biggest problem, that they were spending too much time crafting. And so, again, this dynamic shift, before and now after with this whole thing. But in the builder magazines, you'll see a lot of these things in the 50s begin to talk about prefab, begin to talk about speed and production, be talking about how to build things so that we can put them up fast. Speed is kind of how they're doing it. You also see a number of manufacturers getting into the game of how to build something so that it's a do-it-yourself product, okay? It's something that you can transform a space. There's Dad over there, Leave It to Beaver, covering over that old wallpaper, right, with this new weldwood, plywood that transforms this space. And so, the do-it-yourself era, I've got a cover of a Time magazine from the 50s that a lot of the GIs coming back from the war wanted to fix and work on their houses themselves. But there's a lot of products from manufacturers being made that were meant to ready to assemble, ready to be put together very quickly. And so you have these products. Plywood was a product. I remember reading the Sam Maloof book. He's a furniture maker. That one of his first jobs after the war was to write a book on plywood and how to use it every day in the house. And so it seems weird to us today, but the fact that people just weren't using plywood. But you look at these products and look at how small these, and there's your clamshell molding, the flush interior door, right? The hollow core door, the famous hollow core door. Just is this an example of, how can I build a door cheaper? Well, I could put cardboard in the middle and I could just put a big veneer on the outside. Good idea. I bet we could do that for less. And so these things, it all falls apart. But if you look at the material change alone between World War II and before World War II, all wood floors were wood floors, okay, or tile before 1930. And then people buy an old house and they've got carpet upstairs and they go, I wonder if I have hardwoods upstairs. You always had hardwoods upstairs. That was how you built. After World War II, it's asphalt, linoleum, VCT tiles, and different things like that. Realized that Levitt was putting down plywood floors and then asphalt tiles on top of it. There was no wood floors inside. Wood sheathing or plaster on interior walls, drywall becomes prominent. Tile counters, steel counters turn into plastic laminate and formica. Talked about the size of the starter house. Wood windows and wood doors. Now you're talking about aluminum windows and hollow corridors. Just as a craftsman, as a builder, right? There's not a lot of craft you can put into an aluminum window, right? How do you trim out aluminum window? Well, you don't, right? You run the drywall to it and let it be. So there's a lot of challenges as a craftsman because these new products and new things are going on. But just the difference, 1920s versus 1950s. I mean, this is selling the charm, selling beauty. That's selling production, right? That's selling the business of building, right? And those guys are very serious about building a house. You know, the approach here versus the prefab, right? This idea that they've already got the tile on the wall and they're experimenting with, you know, prefabbing how we can put a bathroom together faster. That doesn't do much for craft, right? That doesn't, you know, help you build more beautifully. The other thing is that today, okay, and you think that's a photoshopped picture, that is a real building, okay? And basically what's happened is classicism and the classical ideals. If you talk about classical ideals with a modern architect, they will just about want to kill you. I was the president of the ICAA in Texas, Institute of Classical Architecture and Art. They are a group that basically trains in classical ideals. We wanted to go to the University of Texas and teach a weekend course in classicism. And basically it was you know, you get there on a Friday, you'd have some stuff, and Saturday and you're done, right? Wouldn't allow us on campus. We're like, why? They go, we don't want you teaching those ideals to our students. So realize that there is you know, we are the enemy as classicists. And so you ask about kind of where the proportions are, that not only is it harder to build these things than they've been forgotten, but they're also repressed by modern architects and modern design. So the ideal of a modern architect is to be unique, is to be the genius, okay? And is not to necessarily recast the past or redo the past. And so, you know, when I was telling you that those ideas are lost and forgotten, it's because they're lost and forgotten and sometimes repressed. This is a chapel. Mies van der Rohe ITT Chapel on Chicago campus. Now, there are proportions and scales in there that you can see the golden ratio and the things that he was laying out, but that is what modern architecture is, right? And why it's so hard to craft what we're doing and put moldings. Like, they don't want moldings in that building. And so the opportunity for us as craftsmen, when the builder says, hey, you know, build a mantle for me, is so big for us, is because that's what they're used to. Okay, and realize that architects are not trained in classicism. Interior designers are not trained in classicism. Builders are not trained in classicism. It is this secret sauce that no one understands. And you have this opportunity, if you understand and learn from the past, to build things that no one else is building. Just a few more slides. You know, this is a house in Texas, okay? What's wrong with this picture, right? Here's a guy that basically a builder who doesn't understand classicism, doesn't understand traditions, and basically says, well, I need a column somewhere. Oh, I guess I'll stick it to the wall up here, right? So I show this because this is opportunity for you guys. This is opportunity to show you the crap that's being built out there and the better things that we could be doing. I think historic designs have a design philosophy, okay? If you look at this arts and crafts house, the ideal of this simplicity, that the ornamentation has function, that this philosophy is in the hardware, it's in the doors, it's in the molding, it's in everything about that, okay? There is no philosophy except curb appeal, right? There's just, I want to make a big show from the front of the house. I want to act like I've got more money than I do, right? I just, I want a big show. And then you go to the back of the house, it's no longer brick, it's vinyl, and it's just cheaping out, right? There's a design philosophy that used to design houses that we don't have anymore. I would argue that the ranch style is our last style that's recognizable, unless you consider a McMansion a style, right? That most houses being built today, maybe the modern farmhouse is something, but there are no recognizable styles today, which makes it hard. And case in point, what style is that?
That's literally my grandmother's house in Alabama.
Right, you got 2 plating windows. 1 wasn't enough. You had to get 2, right? All the cast stone, just it's house. It's not any style. The point is that there's opportunity, guys, to in understanding historic precedent and anybody could make this a better Tudor house than that. I mean, this is terrible, and the opportunity for us, if we understand those traditions and understand those things, we can build better. Last little group. Okay, so this is, I don't know if I do these Wednesday design videos on my YouTube page, and I'm fixing houses all the time. And so this is a Colonial Revival house that I fixed for a client. And immediately, what stands out to you about this house? Dormers. Dormers are too big. What's that? Yeah, you've got this huge mass on the back that overwhelms the front, which caused me to change the roof pitch there. Dialing into, this was my kind of fixed drawing over the top, where to get a bigger mass out here, I'm showing that this roof could be hipped, but it also could be a gable end roof. I've shrunk the size of those dormers quite a bit. I've fixed the entry. I've changed the windows because the windows are the same size. In traditional houses, it's called graduated fenestration. Typically, the windows on the first floor are bigger than the windows on the second floor. And so there's all these small little things that change, right? You see I fixed the front porch by, giving it an architrave and a frieze. There's all there is just one step there, and then you step out into this cornice, I guess. And this railing should sit over top of the columns, but instead it sits right out on the edge and makes it weird looking. And so I am adding another step there. By dropping this down, I make the column bigger because the column was too small before. By pushing this back in, understanding that the neck of the column lines up with the beam of the entablature, that also determines where that railing above goes, that there's just all these subtle little tweaks that you can do that if you understand how those things are put together, you can fix them for your clients and you can fix them. I showed that one of the tricks of building an historic dormer was that the dormer oftentimes had this stud put on its edge, put on its side, so the 1.5 inch side, so that there is because what they've done is they've built the regular 2x4, they framed it like the rest of the house, and this thing got so tall on top because they were trying to build it conventionally instead of building it historically. So by turning the stud on its side and then by bringing this roof down, and instead of going with the isosceles triangle, going with this 22.5 degree difference, you can change how these dormers look and change the look of the house, all by studying historic precedent and classical tradition, right? So it's understanding those two things will make our projects better, will make your clients more appreciative of what you're doing, and really is the secret sauce, I think, to building better.